Throughout human history, certain battles have stood out not merely for their strategic importance or political consequences, but for the sheer scale of destruction they wrought upon the defeated forces. These encounters, characterized by casualty rates often exceeding 70 to 90%, represent the darkest chapters in military history, where entire armies vanished in single days of combat. In ancient warfare, where retreat was often impossible and surrender frequently meant slavery or death, these battles became exercises in systematic annihilation that would echo through millennia. The study of these catastrophic defeats reveals patterns in military thinking, technological disparities, and the fatal consequences of tactical miscalculation. From the dust-choked plains of Cannae to the dark forests of Teutoburg, these battles share common threads: overconfidence meeting cunning, rigid doctrine confronting innovation, and the terrible arithmetic of war, when escape routes are cut off and quarter is neither asked nor given. Understanding these battles requires examining not just the numbers of dead and wounded, but the cultural, technological, and tactical factors that transformed battlefields into killing grounds. The Battle of Cannae, Hannibal's masterpiece of destruction. The Battle of Cannae stands as perhaps the most studied military engagement in history, a tactical masterpiece that military academies still analyze over 2 millennia later. On August 2, 216 BC, on a dusty plain in southeastern Italy near the village of Cannae, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca orchestrated what would become the archetypal battle of annihilation. The Roman Republic, at the height of its power and confidence, committed approximately 86,000 men to crush Hannibal's smaller force of roughly 50,000. By sunset, between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans lay dead on the field, with thousands more captured. The casualty rate of 70 to 80% for the Roman force remains one of the highest in recorded military history for such a large army. Hannibal's tactical genius lay in his ability to turn the Romans' numerical superiority into a liability. He arranged his forces in a convex formation, with his weakest troops, the Gauls and Iberians, in the center, deliberately inviting Roman pressure. As the Roman legions pushed forward, believing they were winning, Hannibal's center gave ground in a controlled retreat, gradually forming a concave shape. Meanwhile, his African heavy infantry on the flanks held firm, and his superior cavalry, having routed the Roman horse, wheeled around to attack the Roman rear. The Romans, packed too tightly in their eagerness to break through what they perceived as a weakening center, found themselves compressed into an ever-shrinking space. The killing that followed was methodical and horrific. Roman soldiers, pressed so tightly they could barely lift their weapons, were cut down where they stood. The ancient historian Livy wrote of Romans found with their heads buried in holes they had dug in the ground, having suffocated themselves rather than face the Carthaginian swords. Some soldiers were discovered still alive the next day, hamstrung and left to die slowly in the heat. The slaughter continued for hours, with Carthaginian troops rotating in fresh fighters to continue the grim work of the Roman command structure. The consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus was killed along with 80 senators, effectively decapitating Roman leadership. The aftermath of Cannae sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean world. In Rome, panic gripped the city as women mourned in the temples and citizens expected Hannibal at the gates. The phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal at the gates, became expression of ultimate dread that would persist in Roman culture for generations. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Cannae was not the scale of Roman losses, but Rome's response to them. Rather than sue for peace, the Republic displayed the iron determination that would eventually win the war, refusing to ransom prisoners and raising new legions from an increasingly depleted manpower pool. The battle taught Rome never again to meet Hannibal in open battle on his terms, leading to the Fabian strategy of attrition that would eventually defeat the Carthaginian. Militarily, Cannae introduced the concept of the double envelopment to Western military thought, a maneuver that would obsess generals for centuries. Frederick the Great, Napoleon, and most notably, German Chief of Staff Alfred von Schlieffen studied Cannae intensively. Schlieffen's plan for World War I was essentially an attempt to recreate Cannae on a continental scale. Even in World War II, generals like Dwight Eisenhower acknowledged Cannae as the model every commander sought to achieve, the complete annihilation of an enemy force in a single engagement. The battle proved that numerical superiority meant nothing without tactical flexibility, and that an army's greatest strength could become its fatal weakness when properly exploited by a master tactician. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest. In September of 9 AD, in the dense forests and marshes of Germania, 3 Roman legions, along with their auxiliary forces, approximately 20,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, marched into oblivion. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest, known to Romans as the Varian disaster after the commanding general Publius Quinctilius Varus, resulted in the effective annihilation of the entire Roman force. Unlike Cannae, where at least some Romans escaped, Teutoburg Forest saw virtually no survivors from the 3 legions. The defeat was so complete, so psychologically devastating, that it permanently ended Roman ambitions of conquering Germania and established the Rhine as the empire's permanent northern frontier. The architect of this destruction was Arminius, a prince of the Germanic Cherusci tribe who had served in the Roman auxiliary forces and earned Roman citizenship. This background gave him intimate knowledge of Roman military tactics, procedures, and most crucially, psychology. Arminius spent years carefully building a coalition of Germanic tribes while maintaining Varus's trust, even serving as an advisor to the Roman general. His deception was so complete that when Segestus, another Germanic chieftain, warned Varus of the brewing rebellion on the very eve of the ambush, the Roman general dismissed the warning as tribal jealousy. The battle itself was less a single engagement than a running slaughter extending over 3 days and perhaps 15 miles of forest tracks. Arminius had reported a fictitious rebellion that required Varus's attention, deliberately leading the Romans away from their fortified camps and into terrain that negated every Roman military advantage. The route led through dense forest, marshland, and narrow defiles where the Roman formation stretched out for miles with baggage trains, camp followers, and soldiers' families could not properly deploy. The path itself had been deliberately sabotaged, with bridges weakened and obstacles placed to slow movement. When the Germanic warriors struck, attacking from concealed positions in coordinated ambushes, the Romans found themselves fighting an enemy they could barely see in terrain that prevented standard battle formations. The famous Roman discipline collapsed as units were isolated and destroyed piecemeal. Rain and storms added to the misery, making bowstrings useless and shields too heavy to carry effectively. On the first day, Varus managed to form a fortified camp, but the respite was temporary. The second day saw continued Germanic attacks as the Romans attempted to break through to safety. By the third day, trapped in the Calcrisa Narrows with escape routes blocked by Germanic earthworks, the remnant of the Roman force made a final desperate attempt to break out. The end came with typical Roman honor and despair. Varus, wounded and seeing the situation hopeless, fell on his sword rather than face capture. His subordinate commanders followed suit. The rank-and-file soldiers faced a grimmer fate. Those not killed outright were enslaved or sacrificed to Germanic gods. The eagles of the three legions, the sacred standards that embodied Roman military honor, were captured and would not be recovered for decades. Archaeological evidence from Kalkriza reveals the thoroughness of the Germanic victory. Scattered coins, fragments of military equipment, and hastily buried remains tell of a force that simply ceased to exist. The psychological impact on Rome was profound. The Emperor Augustus, upon hearing the news, supposedly banged his head against the palace walls, crying Quintilius Varus, "Give me back my legions." For months he refused to shave or cut his hair in mourning. The legion numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never used again, a permanent reminder of the disaster. More significantly, Teutoburg Forest fundamentally altered the trajectory of European history. Had Rome conquered Germania, the linguistic, cultural, and political development of Europe would have been entirely different. The battle ensured that Germanic peoples would remain outside the Roman sphere, free to develop their own cultures that would centuries later bring down the Western Roman Empire itself. The Battle of Carrhae. The disaster at Carrhae in 53 BC demonstrated that Roman military might could be completely neutralized by an enemy employing radically different tactics and fighting in terrain that favored their methods. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome and member of the first triumvirate, alongside Caesar and Pompey, led approximately 35,000 legionaries, 4,000 light infantry, and 4,000 cavalry into Parthian territory, seeking military glory to match his political partners. Instead, he found annihilation in the Mesopotamian desert, with 20,000 Romans killed and 10,000 captured, a casualty rate exceeding 85%. The defeat shattered Roman prestige in the east and demonstrated the vulnerability of heavy infantry to mobile horse archers in open terrain. Crassus's expedition was driven more by personal ambition than strategic necessity. Parthia had shown no aggressive intent toward Rome, but Crassus, at 60 years old, desperately wanted military laurels to rival those of Caesar in Gaul and Pompey in the east. His preparations revealed fatal flaws from the start. He rejected advice to march through the mountains of Armenia, where Roman infantry would have advantages, instead choosing a direct route through the Mesopotamian plains. He dismissed offers of Armenian cavalry support, relying instead on infantry in terrain that offered no protection against mounted archers. Most critically, he underestimated Parthian military capabilities, viewing them as merely another eastern kingdom to be conquered by Roman discipline and steel. The Parthian force that met Crassus near the town of Carrhae was commanded by Sharena, a young noble who understood perfectly how to exploit Roman weaknesses. His army consisted primarily of two types of cavalry: heavily armored cataphracts for shock attacks, and more importantly, thousands of horse archers whose composite bows could penetrate Roman armor at range. Sharena had organized a sophisticated logistics system with trains of camels carrying arrows, ensuring his archers would never run out of ammunition, a detail that would prove decisive. The battle began with Crassus forming his legions into a massive hollow square, a defensive formation designed to prevent encirclement. But this played directly into Parthian hands. The horse archers, maintaining perfect discipline, rode in rotating waves around the Roman formation, shooting arrows in a continuous rain while staying beyond the reach of Roman javelins. When Roman infantry tried to charge, the Parthians simply retreated, shooting backwards in the famous Parthian shot that would enter military lexicon. When Crassus's son Publius led the Gallic cavalry in a desperate charge to drive off the archers, Sirena sprung his trap. The Parthians retreated, drawing Publius far from the main force before surrounding and annihilating his detachment. Publius's head was later paraded before the Roman lines on a spear, breaking whatever morale remained. As the day wore on under the blazing sun, Roman casualties mounted steadily. The hollow square formation, meant for protection, became a death trap as arrows found gaps in shields and armor. Soldiers who raised their shields overhead to block arrows exposed their legs. Those who lowered shields to protect their legs exposed their heads and torsos. The psychological toll was devastating. Romans were dying without ever closing with the enemy, unable to strike back against an opponent who refused to engage in the type of combat they were trained for. By nightfall, with thousands dead and wounded, Crassus attempted to retreat to Carrhae under cover of darkness, abandoning 4,000 wounded who were massacred at dawn. The end came through treachery. Sirena offered negotiations, and Crassus, his situation hopeless, accepted. At the meeting, a scuffle broke out, possibly orchestrated, and Crassus was killed along with his officers. According to legend, the Parthians poured molten gold down Crassus's throat in mockery of his legendary greed. The surviving legionaries faced death or slavery. Those taken prisoner were settled in the far east of the Parthian Empire, with rumors persisting for decades of Roman soldiers serving as mercenaries in Central Asia. The captured eagles became prized Parthian trophies, not recovered until diplomatic negotiations decades later. Carrhae established the Parthian Empire as Rome's equal in the East and introduced Romans to the harsh reality that their military system had fundamental vulnerabilities that clever enemies could exploit with devastating effect. The Battle of the Bagradas River. The Battle of the Bagradas River in 255 BC, also known as the Battle of Tunis, saw the near-complete annihilation of a Roman expeditionary force in North Africa during the First Punic War. The Roman army under Marcus Atilius Regulus, which had successfully invaded Carthaginian territory and won several victories, was virtually destroyed by a reorganized Carthaginian force led by the Spartan mercenary general Xanthippus. Of the approximately 15,000 Roman soldiers engaged, only about 2,000 escaped the battlefield, with the remainder killed or captured, a casualty rate approaching 90%. This catastrophic defeat ended Rome's first attempt to carry the war to African soil and demonstrated the importance of combined arms tactics and appropriate tactical doctrine for specific terrain. The campaign had begun promisingly for Rome. Following their naval victory at Cape Economus, the Romans landed in Africa with a substantial force, defeating Carthaginian armies and advancing toward Carthage itself. Regulus's initial successes led to overconfidence. He offered peace terms so harsh that Carthage had no choice but to continue fighting. This hubris proved fatal when Carthage hired Xanthippus, a Spartan military professional, who immediately recognized that previous Carthaginian defeats stemmed from poor tactics rather than inferior troops. Xanthippus reorganized the Carthaginian army, properly integrating their advantages: war elephants, superior cavalry, and numerous infantry into a cohesive battle plan suited to the flat plains around Tunis. Xanthippus chose his battlefield carefully, selecting flat terrain that would allow his cavalry and elephants maximum effectiveness, while denying the Romans any advantage from their superior heavy infantry. He deployed his forces with 100 war elephants in front, creating a screen that would disrupt Roman formations. Behind these, he placed his phalanx of citizen soldiers and mercenaries, with cavalry on the flanks, 4,000 horsemen who significantly outnumbered the mere 500 Roman cavalry. This deployment represented a complete reversal of previous Carthaginian tactics, which had tried to fight Romans in rough terrain, where elephants and cavalry were less effective. When battle commenced, the Roman legions advanced in their traditional formation, confident in their ability to defeat any Carthaginian army, as they had done before. The war elephants charged first, and while some Roman units managed to drive them off, others were thrown into complete disorder. The Roman infantry that pushed through the elephant screen found themselves engaged with the Carthaginian phalanx in a brutal frontal fight. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian cavalry easily overwhelmed their Roman counterparts, and rather than pursuing fleeing horsemen as was common, wheeled around to attack the Roman infantry's flanks and rear. This disciplined cavalry action, characteristic of Hellenistic warfare but unexpected by the Romans, proved decisive. The Roman legions, pressed from all sides, compressed into an ever-tightening space reminiscent of what would happen at Cannae decades later. Unable to maneuver, with elephants causing havoc in their ranks and cavalry attacking from behind, the Roman formation collapsed. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Regulus himself was captured. His subsequent fate became the subject of Roman legend, with stories of torture and heroic defiance that, while probably fabricated, illustrated Roman horror at the defeat. Only a small force of about 2,000 Romans, who had successfully pushed through the Carthaginian center, managed to escape to the coast and eventually return to Rome. The disaster at the Bagradas River had immediate and long-term consequences. The Roman fleet, arriving to evacuate the army, found only remnants to rescue and was itself destroyed by a storm on the return voyage, compounding the disaster. Rome would not attempt another invasion of Africa for 50 years, instead fighting a grinding war of attrition in Sicily. The battle demonstrated that Roman tactical doctrine, while generally superior, was not invincible and could be countered by appropriate tactics and terrain selection. It also showed the danger of underestimating enemies and the value of professional military expertise. Xanthippe's short service transformed Carthaginian military effectiveness and very nearly changed the course of the war. The Battle of Thermopylae. While the Battle of Thermopylae resulted in far fewer absolute casualties than other ancient battles, it achieved a 100% casualty rate for its defenders, making it the epitome of a last stand in Western military tradition. In late summer of 480 BC, King Leonidas of Sparta, with 300 Spartan hoplites and roughly 1,100 other Greek allies who chose to remain, made their final stand against the massive Persian army of Xerxes I. Every single defender who remained for the last stand was killed, creating one of history's most famous examples of sacrifice and martial valor. Though the numbers were small compared to other battles, the complete annihilation of the defending force and its cultural impact merit its inclusion among history's deadliest battles. The strategic situation that led to Thermopylae was desperate for the Greek city-states. Xerxes' invasion force, estimated by modern historians at between 100,000 men, ancient sources claimed millions, represented an existential threat to Greek independence. The narrow pass at Thermopylae, with mountains on one side and the sea on the other, offered the only position where a small force could hope to delay the Persian advance, while the Greek fleet engaged the Persian navy at Artemisium. Leonidas's force, initially numbering about 7,000 Greeks, took position in the narrowest part of the pass, where the front was only wide enough for a few dozen men to fight simultaneously. For 2 days, the Greek phalanx held the pass against repeated Persian assaults. The heavy bronze armor and long spears of the hoplites, combined with their superior training and discipline, proved devastating in the confined space. Even Xerxes' elite immortals, his personal guard of 10,000 professional soldiers, were repulsed with heavy losses. The Greek tactic of feigned retreats, followed by sudden turns and counterattacks, caused chaos in the Persian ranks. Herodotus records that Xerxes leaped from his throne 3 times in anxiety as he watched his best troops being slaughtered by a force a fraction of their size. The end came through betrayal when a local Greek named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that allowed the Persians to outflank the Thermopylae position. When Leonidas learned that the Persians were approaching from behind, he dismissed most of the Greek allies, keeping only his 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians who volunteered to stay, and 400 Thebans whose loyalty he suspected and wished to test. The decision to remain was not suicidal impulse, but calculated sacrifice. By holding the pass even in death, they would allow the other Greek forces to escape and regroup for future battles. The Battle of Fraustadt. The Battle of Fraustadt, fought on February 3, 1706, during the Great Northern War, stands as one of the most complete tactical victories in military history, and demonstrates how superior tactics and training could overcome numerical disadvantage to achieve near-total enemy destruction. The Swedish army, under Field Marshal Carl Gustav Reinskild, numbering only about 9,500 men, faced a combined Saxon-Russian force of approximately 18,000 under Saxon General Johann Matthias von der Schulenburg. By battle's end, the Allied force had suffered catastrophic losses, 7,377 killed and over 7,300 captured, with total casualties representing nearly 85% of their entire army. The Swedish losses were minimal, roughly 400 killed and 1,000 wounded, making Fraustadt one of the most lopsided victories ever recorded in European warfare. The strategic context of Fraustadt reflected the remarkable military dominance of Sweden under Charles XII, whose armies had defeated coalition after coalition despite being consistently outnumbered. Reinskild, one of Charles's most capable commanders, had been maneuvering in Poland when he learned of Schulenburg's approach. Rather than retreat despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1, Reinskild made the audacious decision to attack, correctly assessing that Swedish tactical superiority and the element of surprise would overcome numerical disadvantage. His decision to fight exemplified the aggressive Swedish military doctrine that emphasized attack, speed, and shock over defensive warfare. Schulenburg had deployed his forces in what he believed was an impregnable position between the villages of Geiersdorf and Rursdorf, with his flanks anchored on frozen marshes that he considered impassable to cavalry. His line consisted of Saxon infantry in the center, with Russian infantry in reserve, and cavalry on both wings. The position was further strengthened with chevaux de frise, portable wooden barriers with spikes, and artillery placement. This deployment represented standard European linear tactics of the period, designed to maximize firepower and prevent enemy breakthrough. However, Schulenburg had not accounted for Swedish tactical innovations and the exceptional training of Swedish forces. Reinskild's battle plan was a masterpiece of tactical innovation that would later be compared to Hannibal's double envelopment at Cannae. He deployed his inferior numbers In an unorthodox formation, his infantry center was arranged in 3 columns rather than traditional lines, while his cavalry was heavily weighted on both flanks. Most critically, Renskield identified that the impassable frozen marshes could actually be navigated by determined cavalry, though with difficulty. His plan called for simultaneous cavalry attacks on both flanks, while his infantry center advanced. But unlike traditional tactics, the Swedish infantry would not stop to engage in firefights, but would charge home with cold steel. The battle commenced at dawn with the Swedish cavalry attacking on both flanks. On the Swedish right, the cavalry plunged directly into the frozen marsh, catching the Saxon left completely by surprise. Though the going was difficult, the Swedish horsemen pushed through, emerging behind the Saxon flank. On the Swedish left, the cavalry charged across more open ground, driving off the Saxon horse through sheer aggression. Meanwhile, the Swedish infantry center advanced at the double quick, a distinctive Swedish tactic called gå på, go on. Rather than stopping to exchange volleys, the Swedish infantry fired a single volley at close range. Some units didn't fire at all, then charged with sword and pike. The psychological impact of the Swedish assault was devastating. The Saxon and Russian troops, trained in the methodical warfare of synchronized volleys and slow advances, were unprepared for the Swedish fury. The Russians, in particular, fought with desperate courage, but were overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the attack. As the Swedish cavalry completed their envelopment, appearing in the Saxon-Russian rear, panic spread through the Allied ranks. Attempts to form a new line facing the rear collapsed as Swedish infantry smashed into their front. The battle devolved into a massacre as Allied troops, trapped between Swedish forces, threw down their weapons in surrender. What followed remains one of the most controversial aspects of the battle. Despite attempts at surrender, particularly by Russian forces, quarter was not initially given. Contemporary accounts describe Swedish soldiers continuing to kill even after enemies had thrown down their weapons. The exact number of Russians executed after surrendering is disputed. Some sources suggest several hundred, others claim higher numbers. Swedish accounts attempt to justify this by claiming their flanks were still engaged, and quarter could not be safely given, but the massacre of prisoners was unusual even by the harsh standards of early 18th century warfare. This merciless approach contributed to the complete destruction of the Allied force and enhanced Swedish reputation for invincibility. The aftermath of Fraustadt had significant strategic implications. The destruction of Schulenburg's army effectively eliminated Saxon military power in Poland, securing Swedish dominance in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Augustus II of Saxony-Poland was forced to abdicate the Polish throne, and Swedish influence reached its zenith. However, the very completeness of victories like Fraustadt may have contributed to Swedish overconfidence that would lead to disaster at Poltava 3 years later. The battle also demonstrated the continued relevance of shock tactics and aggressive leadership even in the age of gunpowder, influencing military thinking across Europe. The Battle of Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415, during the 100 Years' War, resulted in the catastrophic defeat of French chivalry at the hands of a smaller, exhausted, and disease-ridden English army. The French forces, numbering between 12,000 to 25,000 men, according to various estimates, suffered approximately 6,000 to 10,000 casualties, with the cream of French nobility being particularly devastated. The English, numbering only about 6,000 to 9,000 men, with about 5,000 being longbowmen, lost fewer than 500 men. While not achieving the near-total annihilation seen in some ancient battles, Agincourt's casualty ratio and the virtual extermination of the French noble class in certain regions make it one of history's most lopsided defeats. King Henry V's campaign in France had begun with the successful but costly siege of Harfleur, where disease had ravaged his army. Rather than sail directly back to England, Henry decided on a chevauchée, mounted raid through Normandy to Calais, partly to demonstrate his claim to French territory and partly to provoke the French into battle. His army, weakened by dysentery and exhaustion, found itself intercepted by a massive French force near the village of Agincourt. The French, confident in their numerical superiority and eager to avenge previous defeats, were determined to destroy the English army and capture or kill the young king who dared claim the French throne. The battlefield itself became a crucial factor in the English victory. Recent rains had turned the freshly plowed fields between the woods of Agincourt and Tramcourt into a muddy morass. The field was relatively narrow, perhaps 1,000 yards wide, with thick woods on either side that prevented the French from fully deploying their numerical advantage. Henry positioned his men between these woods, with his dismounted men-at-arms in 3 battles, divisions, and long bowmen on the flanks, protected by sharpened stakes driven into the ground. This deployment maximized English firepower while minimizing the frontage the French could attack. The French battle plan, such as it was, reflected the arrogance and internal divisions of their command structure. Multiple nobles claimed precedence, leading to a confused command where personal honor took precedence over tactical sense. The original plan called for crossbowmen and artillery to soften the English lines, followed by cavalry charges to disperse the archers, with dismounted men-at-arms delivering the final blow. However, in their eagerness for glory, the French nobles in the vanguard insisted on leading the attack, pushing aside their own missile troops. The result was that French knights, both mounted and dismounted, would advance directly into the killing ground prepared by English longbowmen. The battle began with Henry, recognizing that French reluctance to attack was allowing them time to organize, ordering his line forward to extreme longbow range. The archers then began their deadly work. English longbowmen could loose 10-12 arrows per minute, with enough force to penetrate armor at closer ranges. As thousands of arrows darkened the sky, the French advance began. The mounted cavalry charges on the flanks, intended to disperse the English archers, foundered in the mud. Horses, struck by arrows and struggling in the morass, crashed into each other or through their riders. Those who reached the English lines were impaled on the stakes or brought down by the archers, who had switched to swords and mallets. The French first battle, consisting primarily of dismounted men-at-arms, advanced through the arrow storm and mud toward the English line. The narrow battlefield compressed their ranks, negating numerical advantage and making them perfect targets. As they struggled through the knee-deep mud in heavy armor, exhaustion set in before they even reached the English. When the lines clashed, the fresher English, fighting on firmer ground they had occupied all night, had a significant advantage. The French, packed too tightly to effectively wield weapons, were pushed back into their second battle, creating more confusion. English archers, having expended their arrows, joined the melee with swords, axes, and hammers, swarming over fallen French knights who, once down in the mud, could not rise again in their heavy armor. The massacre intensified when Henry, fearing a French rally and possible attack on his baggage train, ordered the killing of prisoners, a controversial decision that violated chivalric norms but reflected the desperation of his situation. French nobles, who might have been ransomed for fortunes, were summarily executed. The Third French battle, seeing the destruction of their comrades and the king's ruthlessness, largely fled the field without engaging. The mud-covered field was littered with the cream of French aristocracy: 3 dukes, 9 counts, 90 barons, and thousands of knights died. Entire noble families were extinguished, and some French regions lost virtually their entire military leadership class. The consequences of Agincourt extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The battle shattered French military confidence for a generation and demonstrated that the age of chivalric warfare was ending. The supremacy of disciplined missile troops over heavy cavalry, the importance of terrain and weather, and the vulnerability of aristocratic armies to professional forces all became clear. For England, Agincourt became a defining national myth, immortalized in Shakespeare's Henry V, and remembered as proof that English courage and the longbow could overcome any odds. For France, it necessitated a complete military reorganization that would eventually, under leaders like Joan of Arc, drive the English from French soil. The Battle of Isandlwana. Fought on January 22, 1879, stands as the British Empire's most devastating defeat at the hands of an indigenous force, and one of the few colonial battles where the European force was almost completely annihilated. Of the approximately 1,700 British and colonial troops defending the camp at Isandlwana, over 1,300 were killed, a casualty rate exceeding 75%. The Zulu army of roughly 20,000 warriors, armed primarily with traditional assegais and cowhide shields, overwhelmed a British force equipped with modern Martini-Henry rifles and artillery. The disaster shattered the myth of European invincibility and demonstrated that technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory against determined and well-led indigenous forces. The invasion of Zululand was essentially unauthorized, initiated by Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, and Lord Chelmsford, the military commander, without approval from London. They viewed the independent Zulu kingdom under Cetewayo as an obstacle to British Confederation plans in South Africa. An impossible ultimatum was delivered to Cetewayo, demanding he disband his army of 35,000 warriors. When he inevitably refused, Chelmsford invaded with what he believed was an overwhelming force, divided into 3 columns. His central column, which he personally accompanied, crossed into Zululand at Rorke's Drift on January 11, 1879, supremely confident that British firepower would easily scatter any Zulu resistance. The British camp at Isandlwana was established on January 20, positioned on a gradually sloping plain beneath the distinctive sphinx-like mountain. Critically, Chelmsford ignored standing orders to entrench or form a defensive laager wagon circle, believing such precautions unnecessary against savages armed with spears. His contempt for Zulu military capabilities led him to split his force on January 22, taking roughly half his strength to pursue what he believed was the main Zulu army, leaving Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline with 6 companies of the 24th Regiment of Foot and various colonial units to guard the camp. This division of forces in enemy territory violated basic military principles, but reflected the racist assumptions that pervaded British military thinking. The Zulu attack represented a masterpiece of strategic deception and tactical execution. While Chelmsford pursued a Zulu decoy force, the main imperative army of 20,000 warriors had used the broken terrain to approach within 7 miles of Isandlwana undetected, discovered accidentally by a British mounted patrol around 11 a.m. The Zulus immediately attacked rather than wait for nightfall as planned. Their traditional buffalo horns formation, with the chest engaging frontally while the horns enveloped the flanks, was executed with disciplined precision that would have impressed any European military observer. Initially, British firepower took a terrible toll on the advancing Zulus. The Martini Henry rifle could kill at 1,200 yards, and disciplined volleys created windows of corpses in the Zulu ranks. However, several factors conspired against the British. The Zulu attack developed so rapidly that British companies were deployed piecemeal across an extended line rather than in a concentrated defensive position. Ammunition supply became critical. While sufficient rounds existed in the camp, they were in heavy wooden boxes that required special screwdrivers to open, and the quartermasters, following peacetime regulations, initially refused to distribute ammunition to units other than their own. As individual companies ran low on ammunition, gaps appeared in the British line. The critical moment came when the Zulu right horn worked around the British left flank, threatening the camp from the rear. British cohesion began to collapse as soldiers saw Zulus among the tents. The regular volleys that had held the Zulus at bay became increasingly ragged. Once the Zulus closed to melee range, their numerical superiority and ferocity in close combat proved decisive. British soldiers, trained for volley fire at distance, were overwhelmed in hand-to-hand fighting. The battle became a rout as soldiers fled toward the Buffalo River, pursued by Zulu warriors who showed no mercy. Cetshwayo had ordered that no British be allowed to survive. The scenes of destruction were apocalyptic. British soldiers were hunted down and killed as they ran. Those who made a stand in small groups were surrounded and overwhelmed. At Fugitives Drift, where desperate soldiers attempted to cross the Buffalo River, the water ran red with blood as Zulus killed swimmers in midstream. The camp itself became a charnel house, with bodies scattered among burning tents and overturned wagons. The Zulus, in their fury, killed even the horses, oxen, and dogs in the camp. Of the few who escaped, many were colonial troops familiar with the terrain. Regular British soldiers, weighed down by equipment and unfamiliar with the landscape, stood little chance. The aftermath of Isandlwana sent shock waves throughout the British Empire. When Chelmsford returned to find his camp destroyed and bodies scattered across miles of veldt, the scale of the disaster was initially incomprehensible. The loss of the Queen's Colour of the 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment, though Lieutenants Melville and Coghill died trying to save it, added symbolic weight to the military catastrophe. In Britain, the news caused public outrage and demands for vengeance. The government, which had never authorized the invasion, found itself committed to a war it didn't want, but now couldn't abandon without loss of imperial prestige. The Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 23, 1942 to February 20, 1943, redefined the meaning of total warfare and urban combat, with casualty rates that surpassed even the bloodiest battles of World War I. While exact figures remain disputed, the battle resulted in approximately 2 million casualties combined, with entire units on both sides experiencing 90 to 100% casualty rates. The Soviet 13th Guards Rifle Division, for example, entered the battle with 10,000 men and ended with just 320 survivors, a 97% casualty rate. German 6th Army, which began with roughly 270,000 men, saw 91,000 taken prisoner at the surrender, of whom only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad became synonymous with apocalyptic urban warfare, where survival was measured in hours and meters were paid for in hundreds of lives. The strategic importance of Stalingrad transcended its industrial value or position on the Volga River. For Hitler, the city bearing Stalin's name became an obsession, a symbol that had to be conquered to demonstrate German supremacy. For Stalin, its defense became equally symbolic. Order 227, not one step back, made retreat punishable by death. The city's defenders were told they were fighting not just for a city, but for the survival of the Soviet Union itself. This psychological dimension transformed what might have been a strategic withdrawal into a fight to the death that would consume entire armies. The initial German assault in August and September 1942 seemed unstoppable. The Luftwaffe reduced much of the city to rubble in massive bombing raids, killing thousands of civilians who Stalin had refused to evacuate, believing their presence would motivate the defenders. German forces, spearheaded by elite units, pushed into the city, expecting a quick victory. By mid-September, they controlled 90% of Stalingrad, pushing Soviet forces to a narrow strip along the western bank of the Volga. Victory seemed days away, but the Germans had entered a tactical nightmare where their advantages in mobile warfare and combined arms meant nothing. The ruins of Stalingrad negated every German tactical advantage. Tanks couldn't traverse the rubble-strewn streets and became death traps for their crews. The Luftwaffe couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the smoke and dust. Artillery was as likely to hit German as Soviet positions in the confused urban fighting. Combat devolved into primitive struggles for individual buildings, floors, and even rooms. The grain elevator, the Mamayev-Korgan Hill, the Red October factory, Pavlov's house. These locations became legendary for the intensity of fighting, where positions changed hands multiple times daily, and corpses piled so high they served as fortifications. Soviet tactics, developed through bloody experience, turned the urban landscape into a weapon. Small storm groups armed with submachine guns, grenades, and knives infiltrated German positions through sewers, rubble, and hidden passages. Snipers, including the famous Vasily Zaitsev, turned movement in daylight into suicide. Soviet artillery on the eastern bank of the Volga, safe from German counter-battery fire, pulverized German positions with observed fire. At night, reinforcements crossed the Volga under fire, with many boats sunk and entire units drowning before reaching combat. The life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad was often less than 24 hours, yet they kept coming. The German Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, found itself in an increasingly impossible situation. Every building captured cost irreplaceable casualties. Veteran soldiers who had conquered France and much of Russia died clearing rooms. The joke among German soldiers was that they had captured the kitchen, but were still fighting for the living room. Units reported being at full strength in the morning and combat ineffective by evening. The 24th Panzer Division, which entered the city with 140 tanks, was reduced to 3 operational vehicles, yet retreat was impossible. Hitler had forbidden it, and the symbolic value of Stalingrad made withdrawal unthinkable. The Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, launched on November 19, 1942, targeted not the Germans in Stalingrad, but the weaker Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies guarding the flanks. Within days, these forces collapsed and the Sixth Army was encircled. Hitler's decision to supply the trapped army by air proved catastrophically inadequate. The Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of needed supplies. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Temperatures dropped to -30°, food ran out, ammunition dwindled, and medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded soldiers froze to death where they lay. Horses, dogs, and eventually rats were eaten. Cases of cannibalism were reported. The final phase, from January to February 1943, saw the complete disintegration of the Sixth Army. Soviet forces systematically reduced the pocket, splitting it into smaller segments that were annihilated piecemeal. German soldiers, frostbitten, starving, and out of ammunition, surrendered in droves despite Hitler's orders to fight to the last man. Paulus, promoted to field marshal with the expectation he would commit suicide rather than surrender, chose captivity. When the last German positions capitulated on February 10, 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist. Of the 91,000 prisoners, most would die in Soviet camps within months from disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition. The Battle of Kiev. The Battle of Kiev, fought from August 23 to September 26, 1941, resulted in the most catastrophic defeat in Soviet military history and the largest encirclement battle ever conducted. The Wehrmacht surrounded and destroyed an entire Soviet front, with approximately 600,000 Soviet soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of weeks, representing a near-total annihilation of Soviet forces in Ukraine. The Southwestern Front, which had begun the battle with roughly 760,000 men, simply ceased to exist as a military formation. This unprecedented military disaster opened the path to Moscow and brought the Soviet Union to the brink of collapse, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of German blitzkrieg tactics when executed against an unprepared and poorly led opponent. The strategic situation leading to Kiev reflected the broader catastrophe engulfing Soviet forces in the summer of 1941. Operation Barbarossa had shattered Soviet border armies, and German forces were advancing on three fronts toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine. Hitler, against the advice of his generals who wanted to push directly for Moscow, decided to eliminate the massive Soviet forces around Kiev first, viewing them as a threat to the flanks of Army Group Center. This decision, while controversial among German commanders, would result in one of the Wehrmacht's most complete victories. Stalin's refusal to allow withdrawal from Kiev transformed a dangerous situation into catastrophe. Despite clear evidence of German pincers closing around the Kiev salient, Stalin insisted that the Ukrainian capital, with its symbolic and economic importance, must not be abandoned. Marshal Budyonny, commanding the Southwestern Front, requested permission to withdraw while escape was still possible, but was refused and subsequently removed from command. His replacement, Marshal Timoshenko, arrived too late to affect the outcome. Soviet forces were ordered to hold positions that were already being outflanked, fighting where they stood rather than conducting the strategic withdrawal that might have saved the armies. World War II catastrophes and modern massacres. The Battle of Berlin. The Battle of Berlin, fought from April 16 to May 4, 1945, represented the final death throes of Nazi Germany and resulted in casualty rates approaching total annihilation for the defending forces. Of the approximately 45,000 Wehrmacht and SS soldiers, supplemented by 40,000 Volkssturm, militia, and Hitler Youth who defended Berlin's inner defenses, fewer than 5,000 managed to escape westward before the surrender. The rest were killed or captured in savage urban fighting that reduced Germany's capital to rubble, including the outer defensive operations. German military casualties exceeded 450,000, with Soviet forces suffering 350,000 casualties in the battle's final phase. Berlin demonstrated what happens when political fanaticism meets military reality, the complete destruction of armies ordered to fight to the last man in a hopeless cause. The defense of Berlin was militarily hopeless from the start. The Wehrmacht had been bled white in 5 years of war, with most remaining experienced units destroyed in the Bagradas offensive and the Ardennes. The forces defending Berlin were a hodgepodge of shattered divisions, rear area personnel, anti-aircraft crews fighting as infantry, and elderly men and children conscripted into the Volkssturm. Many defenders had no military training and were armed with captured weapons or single-shot Panzerfausts. Against them, the Soviet Union marshaled 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, and 41,600 artillery pieces, the largest concentration of military power ever assembled for a single operation. Hitler's decision to defend Berlin to the last man and last bullet reflected his complete divorce from reality. Ensconced in his Führer bunker, he issued impossible orders to non-existent armies and spoke of miracle weapons that would turn the tide. SS and Nazi Party officials executed soldiers and civilians for defeatism, hanging bodies from lampposts with signs reading, "I am a deserter," or "I refuse to fight for my people." The entire population was to be mobilized for a final battle that would either save the Reich or ensure its complete destruction. Bridges were mined, buildings turned into fortresses, and orders given that nothing of value should survive German defeat. The Soviet assault began with the largest artillery barrage in history. Over 9,000 guns and rocket launchers fired along the Oder-Neisse line, delivering more explosive power in the opening bombardment than all Allied bombing of Germany in 1942. The Battle of Seelow Heights, the last major defensive position before Berlin, saw 3 days of horrific fighting as Soviet forces battered through elaborate German defenses. Soviet Marshal Zhukov, under pressure from Stalin to take Berlin before the Western Allies, drove his forces forward with ruthless determination, accepting massive casualties for speed. Tank armies were committed before infantry had cleared paths, resulting in terrible losses to Panzerfausts in the hands of Hitler Youth. Once Soviet forces entered Berlin proper on April 20, Hitler's birthday, the battle became an urban meat grinder, surpassing even Stalingrad in intensity. Every street, building, and subway tunnel was contested. SS units, knowing they could expect no mercy, fought with suicidal determination. Foreign SS units, French, Norwegian, Latvian, made fanatical last stands, preferring death to Soviet captivity. The Hitler Youth, some as young as 12, manned anti-aircraft guns against tanks and died at their posts. Combat engineers blew up buildings with Soviet soldiers inside, while Soviet artillery fired over open sites, demolishing entire blocks to clear resistance. The civilian population, trapped in the city by Nazi officials who had forbidden evacuation, suffered horribly. Thousands died in artillery bombardments and street fighting. Women and girls faced systematic rape by Soviet soldiers, seeking vengeance for German atrocities in the Soviet Union. Suicides reached epidemic proportions as families poisoned themselves rather than face Soviet occupation. The city's infrastructure completely collapsed. No water, electricity, gas, or food distribution. Bodies lay unburied in the streets, and the wounded died without medical care in cellars and subway stations. The final phase of the battle centered on the government district and Hitler's bunker. Soviet forces methodically reduced the shrinking pocket, with combat so close that opponents fought from opposite sides of the same street, even the same building. The Reichstag, though militarily worthless, became a symbolic objective that cost thousands of casualties. On April 30, as Soviet forces approached his bunker, Hitler committed suicide, followed by Goebbels and other Nazi leaders. Yet fighting continued as die-hard SS units refused to surrender and attempted breakouts that turned into massacres. The surrender on May 2 found Berlin transformed into a moonscape of rubble and corpses. Entire districts had been leveled, with 600,000 apartments destroyed. Conservative estimates place civilian deaths at 125,000, with many more dying in the aftermath from disease, starvation, and suicide. Of Berlin's defenders, those who survived faced Soviet captivity, where many would die in the following years. The battle marked not just the end of Nazi Germany, but the complete annihilation of an army and ideology that had chosen death over surrender. Berlin joined the ranks of history's most complete military catastrophes, where political fanaticism ensured maximum destruction. The Battle of Manila, 1945. Urban warfare without mercy. The Battle of Manila, fought from February 3 to March 3, 1945, stands as one of the Pacific theater's most brutal urban battles and resulted in the near-complete annihilation of the Japanese garrison. Of the approximately 17,000 Japanese naval and army personnel defending Manila, only about 1,000 survived as prisoners, a casualty rate exceeding 94%. The battle also resulted in one of World War II's worst humanitarian catastrophes, with an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians massacred by Japanese forces or killed in the crossfire. Manila's destruction ranked second only to Warsaw among Allied capitals, demonstrating the horrific cost when fanatical defenders choose annihilation over surrender in an urban environment. The strategic situation leading to Manila was complex. General Yamashita, Japan's most capable commander, had ordered the city abandoned, recognizing it couldn't be defended and wanting to spare civilian casualties. However, Rear Admiral Iwabuchi, commanding 17,000 naval personnel, disobeyed these orders, deciding to fight to the death in accordance with Japanese naval tradition. His forces, joined by army units that refused to withdraw, fortified themselves in the city's modern concrete buildings, particularly in the government district and the old Spanish walled city of Intramuros. They had no hope of victory or even successful defense, only the intention to kill as many Americans and Filipinos as possible before dying. The American assault, led by General MacArthur's forces, initially expected light resistance. MacArthur, having declared, "I have returned," and wanting to preserve the city where he had served before the war, initially restricted artillery and airstrikes. However, as American forces encountered fanatical resistance and suffered mounting casualties, these restrictions were gradually lifted. The 1st Cavalry and 37th Infantry Divisions found themselves in vicious urban combat, unlike anything previously experienced in the Pacific. Every building became a fortress, every room a battleground. Japanese defensive tactics reflected their acceptance of death and determination to inflict maximum casualties. Buildings were interconnected by tunnels and passages, allowing defenders to appear behind American lines. Naval guns and artillery were emplaced in buildings, firing point-blank at American tanks. Mines and booby traps were everywhere, in doorways, furniture, even corpses. Japanese sailors, untrained in ground combat, but indoctrinated with Bushido spirit, fought with improvised weapons when ammunition ran out. Surrender attempts were met with grenades or suicide attacks, teaching American soldiers that no quarter could be expected or given. The horror of Manila transcended military combat through systematic Japanese atrocities against Filipino civilians. As defeat became inevitable, Japanese forces embarked on an orgy of killing, rape, and destruction that shocked even battle-hardened American troops. Entire families were herded into buildings that were then set ablaze. Hospitals were attacked, with patients, nurses, and doctors bayoneted in their beds. The Bayview Hotel massacre saw 400 civilians machine-gunned. At De La Salle College, brothers and civilians were shot and mutilated. Women and girls were raped and murdered throughout the city. These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic murder ordered by Japanese officers who viewed Filipino civilians as enemies deserving death. The battle for Intramuros, Manila's historic walled city, epitomized the fighting's brutality. The ancient walls, built to withstand 16th-century cannon, proved remarkably resistant to modern artillery. Japanese defenders had turned every building into a fortress, with interlocking fields of fire covering all approaches. American forces finally breached the walls using point-blank artillery fire, then fought room by room through the ruins. Civilians trapped inside faced death from both sides. Japanese forces killed them as traitors, while American artillery and flamethrowers made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Of 7,000 civilians in Intramuros when fighting began, fewer than 500 survived. The final phase saw Japanese forces compressed into ever smaller pockets as American artillery systematically demolished their positions. The Commonwealth Building, Finance Building, and other government structures were reduced to rubble with defenders inside. Japanese officers conducted ceremonial suicides, while enlisted men launched final banzai charges or fought until killed at their posts. Admiral Iwabuchi committed seppuku in his command bunker as American forces closed in. By March 3, organized resistance ended, though isolated Japanese holdouts continued fighting for days. Manila's liberation came at horrific cost. The Pearl of the Orient lay in ruins, with entire districts resembling Berlin or Stalingrad. The systematic massacre of civilians, men bayoneted, women raped and murdered, children thrown into the air and caught on bayonets left psychological scars that affected Filipino-Japanese relations for generations. The near-total annihilation of Japanese forces demonstrated their military's preference for death over dishonor, a mentality that influenced American planning for the invasion of Japan, and ultimately the decision to use atomic weapons. Manila joined the grim list of urban battles, where modern warfare's destructive power combined with ideological fanaticism to create near-total destruction. The Siege of Baghdad. 1258. The Mongol annihilation of Islamic civilization. The siege and destruction of Baghdad by Mongol forces in 1258 represents one of history's most complete urban annihilations and marked the violent end of the Islamic Golden Age. When Hulagu Khan's Mongol army of approximately 150,000 warriors stormed Baghdad on February 13, 1258, they systematically exterminated the city's population, with death toll estimates ranging from 200,000 to 2 million inhabitants. The Abbasid Caliphate's army of 50,000 was completely destroyed, and the civilian population faced near-total extermination. The Mongols' systematic destruction was so thorough that Baghdad, once the world's largest and most prosperous city, wouldn't recover its pre-siege population until the 20th century. The Mongol approach to Baghdad represented their standard practice, perfected across decades of conquest: surrender and live, resist and face complete annihilation. Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, had been dispatched by Great Khan Mumke to complete the Mongol conquest of Islamic lands. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim, ruling from Baghdad, represented both spiritual and temporal authority for much of the Islamic world. His refusal to submit to Mongol authority sealed Baghdad's fate. The Mongols viewed any resistance not just as military opposition, but as defiance of divine Mongol destiny, requiring absolute punishment. The siege itself was brief but decisive, lasting only 13 days before the walls were breached. Mongol military superiority was overwhelming. They employed Chinese siege engineers who constructed advanced catapults and used early gunpowder weapons. The Mongols diverted canals to flood defensive positions and undermine walls. Most critically, they had learned from every siege across their empire, applying accumulated knowledge of fortification reduction. The Abbasid army, despite Baghdad's formidable walls and defensive position between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was poorly led and divided. The Caliph, trusting in Baghdad's historic inviolability and the spiritual protection of his office, had failed to adequately prepare for siege. When Mongol forces breached Baghdad's walls on February 10, they waited 3 days before entering, a standard Mongol practice that heightened terror while allowing defenders to contemplate their fate. When they entered on February 13, the massacre began. The Mongols methodically divided the city into sectors, with each unit assigned areas to clear. The killing was organized and systematic. Inhabitants were herded into open areas and executed en masse. Pyramids of severed heads were erected outside the city walls. The Mongols had quotas. Each warrior was reportedly required to present a specific number of heads, with some sources claiming quotas of 24 heads per Mongol soldier. The destruction transcended simple massacre. Baghdad's Grand Library, containing centuries of accumulated knowledge, was thrown into the Tigris, supposedly turning the river black with ink. The House of Wisdom, the intellectual center of the Islamic world, was demolished with its scholars executed. Hospitals, schools, mosques, and palaces were systematically destroyed. The elaborate irrigation system that had sustained Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia was deliberately wrecked, turning fertile land into desert. This wasn't random violence, but calculated destruction intended to ensure the region could never again challenge Mongol power. The fate of Caliph al-Mustaz became legendary. Captured alive, he was reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses. The Mongols believed royal blood shouldn't touch the ground. Another account has him locked in his treasure room to starve among his gold. His death ended the Abbasid Caliphate that had ruled for 500 years, creating a spiritual crisis in the Islamic world. The systematic execution of Baghdad's scholars, poets, scientists, and theologians effectively ended the Islamic Golden Age, with incalculable loss to human knowledge and culture. The aftermath left Baghdad a ghost city. Contemporary accounts describe streets literally running with blood, piles of corpses so high they resembled hills, and a stench of death that made the city uninhabitable for months. Disease followed massacre as corpses contaminated water supplies. Survivors fled to spread tales of Mongol terror, serving Mongol strategic purposes by encouraging other cities to surrender. The agricultural collapse following irrigation system destruction caused famine that killed additional hundreds of thousands. Baghdad wouldn't recover for centuries. When later travelers visited, they found ruins inhabited by a few thousand survivors where once stood Islam's greatest city. The Siege of Leningrad. The Siege of Leningrad, lasting 872 days from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944, produced casualty figures that dwarf most battles in human history, with scholarly estimates of civilian deaths alone ranging from 1 million to 1.5 million. While not a battle in the traditional sense, the siege represents one of history's most complete attempts at urban annihilation through starvation and bombardment. The pre-war population of 3.2 million was reduced by more than half, with some months seeing 100,000 deaths from starvation, disease, and cold. Entire categories of citizens, the elderly, children, the sick, experienced near-total mortality rates. Leningrad demonstrated warfare's ultimate horror, the deliberate starvation of an entire city as a weapon of war. Hitler's plans for Leningrad were explicitly genocidal. The city, as the birthplace of Bolshevism and bearing the name of the Soviet Union's founder, was to be erased from existence. Wehrmacht Directive explicitly stated the city was to be surrounded, bombarded, and starved, with any surrender attempts refused. The population was to perish, and the city razed. This wasn't military strategy, but racial warfare. The elimination of Slavic populations to create Lebensraum for German settlers. Finnish forces, Germany's co-belligerents, participated in the encirclement, but generally refrained from active bombardment, creating controversy that persists today. The initial German advance in summer 1941 was rapid, reaching Leningrad's outskirts by early September. The last rail line was cut on August 30, and by September 8, the city was completely surrounded, except for access across Lake Ladoga. Evacuation attempts had been delayed by Soviet authorities' reluctance to show defeatism, trapping hundreds of thousands who might have escaped. As winter approached, the city's food supplies dwindled rapidly. The bread ration, incorporating sawdust and cellulose to extend supplies, dropped to 125 grams daily for civilians, about 3 thin slices. This was often the only food available, providing perhaps 300 calories when 3,000 were needed to survive winter temperatures, reaching -40 dubs. The winter of 1941-42 witnessed death on an industrial scale. Without fuel for heating, temperatures inside apartments matched those outside. People burned furniture, books, and floorboards for warmth, then died frozen in their beds. Water pipes burst, forcing inhabitants to collect water from the frozen Neva River under German artillery fire. The city's transport system collapsed, no fuel for vehicles, no food for horses. Bodies accumulated in apartments, streets, and hospitals faster than they could be buried in the frozen ground. Mass graves were dynamited into the permafrost, filled with corpses stacked like cordwood. Starvation's progression was methodically documented by survivors. First came obsession with food. People discussed imaginary meals, wrote menus, dreamed of bread. Then dystrophy, muscle wasting that made walking impossible. The blockade face appeared, skin stretched over skull, eyes sunken, expression vacant. People collapsed in bread lines and died where they fell. Cannibalism emerged despite severe penalties. Police records showed 2,000 arrests, though the real number was certainly higher. Families faced impossible choices, dividing inadequate rations, choosing who would eat, who would die. Children orphaned by starvation wandered streets until they too died. The road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga provided minimal relief, but at terrible cost. Truck drivers navigated ice roads under German bombardment, many drowning when vehicles broke through ice weakened by bombs. Supplies brought in were insufficient. The city needed 1,000 tons daily, but rarely received 300. Priority went to defending troops and essential workers, leaving ordinary civilians to starve. Even this lifeline demonstrated Soviet priorities. Evacuating factory equipment sometimes took precedence over evacuating people. Cultural and social life continued surreally amid mass death. Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, premiered in the besieged city, performed by starving musicians. Some died during rehearsals. Schools operated until teachers and pupils died at their desks. Scientists at the world-famous seed bank starved to death rather than eat preserved specimens, protecting genetic resources for humanity's future. This determination to maintain civilization while dying represented spiritual resistance to German attempts at dehumanization. The siege's end came gradually as Soviet forces pushed Germans back, fully lifting the blockade on January 27, 1944. The liberation revealed a city of walking dead, survivors weighing half their pre-war weight, psychologically shattered, often unable to digest normal food after prolonged starvation. Entire families had vanished, entire neighborhoods depopulated. The demographic impact lasted generations. The absence of children who would have been born, the genetic damage from prolonged malnutrition, the psychological trauma transmitted across generations. The Battle of Changchun. The forgotten siege of the Chinese Civil War. The siege of Changchun, lasting from May to October 1948, represents one of the Chinese Civil War's most devastating episodes, with civilian casualty rates that rank among the highest in modern warfare. Of the approximately 500,000 civilians trapped in the city when communist forces encircled it, between 150,000 and 300,000 died, primarily from starvation, a mortality rate of 30 to 60%. The nationalist garrison of 100,000 troops was ultimately forced to surrender, with thousands dying during the siege. The communist strategy of surround but don't attack, trap but don't fight, turned Changchun into a death trap where civilians paid the ultimate price for military objectives, demonstrating how modern siege warfare could achieve medieval levels of devastation. Changchun's strategic importance stemmed from its position as a major industrial center and transportation hub in Manchuria. The nationalist Kuomintang/KMT forces under General Zheng Dongguo had heavily fortified the city, intending it as a stronghold from which to control northeast China. The Communist People's Liberation Army, PLA, under Lin Biao, recognized that direct assault would prove costly against prepared defenses. Instead, they implemented a blockade strategy designed to starve the city into submission, calculating that hunger would succeed where bullets might fail. This decision transformed Changchun's civilian population into expendable pawns in the larger strategic game. The communist cordon around Changchun was remarkably effective, consisting of trenches, barbed wire, and checkpoints that sealed the city completely. No food, medicine, or supplies could enter. More controversially, civilians attempting to leave were turned back at gunpoint. The PLA's policy was deliberately cruel. They would accept defecting nationalist soldiers, but refuse to allow civilian refugees to pass, forcing them back to consume the city's dwindling supplies. This created what survivors called the death zone, a no-man's land between the lines where desperate civilians refused passage by both sides, died in thousands. Bodies piled up in this zone, creating a macabre barrier that both sides used for psychological warfare. Inside Changchun, conditions deteriorated rapidly as food supplies dwindled. The nationalist command had stockpiled supplies for their troops, but made inadequate provision for civilians. As hunger spread, social order collapsed. The price of grain increased 100-fold, then became unavailable at any price. People ate bark, leather, and grass. Pets disappeared, followed by reports of cannibalism. Bodies littered streets as families lacked strength to bury their dead. The nationalist troops, better fed but watching civilians starve, faced moral collapse. Desertion increased despite executions for attempted defection. The civilian tragedy intensified as desperate families attempted escape. Parents faced impossible choices. Attempting to flee meant probable death in the death zone. Staying meant certain starvation. Some families split, sending children out, hoping communist soldiers might show mercy. These children, many orphaned when their parents died attempting escape, wandered the death zone until they too perished. Communist loudspeakers broadcast promises of food for defecting soldiers while explicitly stating civilians would be turned back. Psychological warfare that demoralized defenders watching civilians starve. International observers, and even some communist commanders, expressed discomfort with the siege's humanitarian cost. Internal PLA documents reveal debates about the civilian casualties, with some officers arguing the political cost outweighed military benefits. However, Lin Biao maintained the blockade, viewing civilian suffering as necessary pressure on the nationalist garrison. This calculated cruelty succeeded by October, with troops near mutiny and civilians dying by hundreds daily. The nationalist command negotiated surrender. The 60th Army defected en masse, followed by the new 7th Army's surrender, effectively ending resistance. The Battle of Arausio. The Battle of Arausio, fought on October 6, 1005 BC, inflicted upon Rome one of its greatest military disasters, with ancient sources reporting 80,000 Roman and allied soldiers killed and 40,000 camp followers slaughtered, casualty figures that potentially exceeded even Cannae. The Germanic Cimbri and Teutones tribes achieved near-complete annihilation of two Roman armies that, due to their commanders' mutual hatred, fought separately and were destroyed in detail. The disaster exposed Rome to invasion, triggered military reforms that would transform the Republic into an empire, and demonstrated that barbarian peoples could utterly destroy Roman legions when Roman leadership failed catastrophically. The crisis began with the southward migration of the Cimbri and Teutones from Jutland, driven by climate change and population pressure. These weren't mere raiders, but entire peoples, men, women, and children seeking new lands. Initial Roman attempts to stop them had failed disastrously, including the destruction of a consular army at Norea in 1113 BC. By 105 BC, the Germanic tribes had crossed into Gaul and threatened the Roman province of Gallia Narbonensis, potentially opening the route to Italy itself. Rome responded by sending two armies, a fatal decision complicated by political rivalry and social prejudice that would ensure disaster. The two Roman commanders embodied the Republic's internal divisions. Quintus Servilius Caepio, a patrician consul, commanded the senior army. Gnaeus Malleus Maximus, a new man novus homo from a non-aristocratic background, held imperium as proconsul with a second army. Despite facing a common enemy, Caepio refused to cooperate with someone he viewed as a social inferior. He camped separately, refused to coordinate plans, and even prevented supplies from reaching Malleus's forces. This division, born of aristocratic arrogance, created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. The Romans faced approximately 200,000 Germanic warriors, though this number likely included non-combatants. The Germanic forces, led by King Boiarix of the Cimbri and King Teutoburg of the Teutones, recognized the opportunity presented by Roman division. Rather than attacking both camps simultaneously, they could defeat each army separately. The Germans had learned from previous encounters with Roman forces, understanding their tactics and exploiting their weaknesses. They possessed superior cavalry, longer swords, effective against Roman short swords in open combat, and most critically, unified command against divided enemies. The battle unfolded as two separate disasters. Capio, learning that Malleus was negotiating with the Germans and fearing his rival might claim victory, launched an unauthorized attack to seize glory. His force, advancing without coordination or support, was surrounded and annihilated. Germanic cavalry prevented retreat, while infantry pressed from all sides. The destruction was complete. Capio survived, but his entire army perished. The Germans then turned on Malleus's army, already demoralized by witnessing their compatriots' destruction. Despite desperate resistance, this second army met the same fate. Roman discipline collapsed as Germans breached the camp, slaughtering soldiers and camp followers indiscriminately. The aftermath shocked Rome more than Cannae. While Hannibal had destroyed a larger army, he was recognized as a military genius. The Cimbri and Teutones were dismissed as barbarians, making their victory more psychologically devastating. The road to Italy lay open, protected only by scattered garrisons. Panic gripped Rome. Citizens expected Germanic hordes at the gates. The disaster's political consequences were immediate. Capio was tried for treason, his property confiscated, and he died in exile. More significantly, the disaster brought Gaius Marius to power, whose military reforms, creating professional legions loyal to commanders rather than the state, would ultimately destroy the Republic. The Battle of the Somme. July 1st, 1916, remains the bloodiest day in British military history, with the British Expeditionary Force suffering approximately 57,470 casualties, 19,240 killed, and 38,230 wounded in a single day of fighting. Some battalions experienced casualty rates exceeding 90%, effectively ceasing to exist as fighting units within hours of going over the top. The disaster demonstrated that military thinking had failed to adapt to industrial warfare's realities, where machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire had made traditional infantry assaults virtually suicidal. The first day of the Somme became synonymous with military futility, the destruction of Britain's volunteer PALS battalions, and the end of innocence about modern war's nature. The Somme offensive was conceived as the big push that would break the deadlock of trench warfare and win the war. General Douglas Haig, commanding the British forces, believed that a week-long artillery bombardment, 1.7 million shells fired, would destroy German defenses, cut barbed wire, and allow infantry to walk across no man's land and occupy empty trenches. This plan reflected catastrophic misunderstanding of modern defensive systems. German dugouts, some 40 feet deep, protected defenders from all but direct hits. Much of the British artillery consisted of shrapnel shells ineffective against earthworks, and many shells were duds due to rapid wartime production. Most critically, the bombardment alerted Germans to the coming assault, eliminating surprise. The British forces attacking on July 4 were largely from Kitchener's new army, enthusiastic volunteers who had enlisted in 1914-15, organized into PALS battalions, where friends, neighbors, and co-workers served together. These men had minimal combat experience and were trained in tactics already obsolete. They were ordered to advance in lines at walking pace, carrying 60-70 pounds of equipment, maintaining formation to present an imposing sight. Officers were told the Germans would be destroyed by bombardment. Resistance would be minimal. This optimism would cost tens of thousands of lives in the first hours of battle. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew along the British line, and men climbed from trenches into hell. German machine gunners, emerging from deep dugouts unharmed, had perfect fields of fire across no man's land. The slaughter was immediate and horrific. Entire waves of men were cut down before reaching their own barbed wire. Machine guns, pre-registered on gaps in British wire, created kill zones where bodies piled in windows. Some units advancing in parade ground formation were annihilated so quickly that German machine gunners, horrified by the slaughter, temporarily ceased fire to allow survivors to retreat. Most British soldiers never saw an enemy soldier. They simply walked into a storm of steel and died. Individual unit experiences revealed the catastrophe's scale. The Newfoundland Regiment, attacking at Beaumont Hamel, advanced when communication failures prevented cancellation of their assault, despite the first wave's destruction. Of 780 men who attacked, 684 became casualties within 30 minutes, an 87% casualty rate. Every officer was killed or wounded. The regiment effectively ceased to exist, devastating Newfoundland's small dominion. The 10th Battalion West Yorkshire Regiment suffered 710 casualties from 800 men. Some companies had no survivors. Entire towns lost a generation of young men in minutes, creating demographic scars lasting decades. The tactical failure was complete along most of the front. Of 120,000 British troops who attacked, few reached German trenches, fewer still held gains. German counterattacks recaptured most lost ground by nightfall. The only significant success came where tactics differed: creeping barrages, infantry-hugging artillery fire, and exploitation of local conditions. But these lessons were overwhelmed by the disaster's scale elsewhere. German casualties, while significant at about 8,000, were a fraction of British losses. German defenders spoke of the tragedy they witnessed. Brave men walking to certain death, maintaining formation until machine guns cut them down. The Battle of Verdun, 1916. The Meat Grinder. The Battle of Verdun, lasting from February 21 to December 18, 1916, became synonymous with the grinding attrition of World War I, producing combined casualties approaching 1 million men. While not achieving the single-day casualty rates of other battles, Verdun's 10-month duration created cumulative horror where entire divisions were repeatedly destroyed and reconstituted. French and German forces suffered roughly equal casualties, approximately 400,000 each, in fighting that gained virtually no territory. Some units experienced over 100% casualties through replacement and redestruction cycles. Verdun epitomized war as industrial process, where victory meant marginally better ability to replace losses in the meat grinder that consumed Europe's youth. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn conceived Verdun not as breakthrough, but as attrition to bleed France white, by attacking a position France must defend for symbolic reasons. Verdun's forts protected the path to Paris and held emotional significance from previous wars. Falkenhayn calculated France would sacrifice its army defending Verdun, suffering unsustainable casualties that would force negotiated peace. This strategy of deliberate attrition, treating human lives as industrial inputs, marked warfare's moral nadir. The battle would demonstrate that such calculations work both ways. The attacker bleeds as profusely as defender. The initial German assault on February 24 began with the war's most concentrated artillery bombardment, 1,400 guns firing 100,000 shells per hour on an 8-mile front. Entire forests were obliterated, villages erased, the landscape transformed into a moonscape. French frontline positions were pulverized, with survivors deafened, concussed, and buried alive. German stormtroopers, using infiltration tactics that would dominate future warfare, initially advanced rapidly. Fort Douaumont, Verdun's strongest fortification, fell almost without resistance when a small German unit found it virtually undefended. French collapse seemed imminent. The French response, "They shall not pass, I ne passeront pas," transformed military necessity into national crusade. General Philippe Pétain organized the Sacred Way, Voie Sacrée, a single road carrying 6,000 trucks daily to supply Verdun. French artillery, concentrated on the Meuse's east bank, created killing fields where German attacks dissolved. The battle devolved into struggle for individual positions. Fort Vaux, Fleury Village, Hill 304, Mort Home, Dead Man's Hill, that changed hands repeatedly in fighting of unprecedented intensity. Fleury was captured and recaptured 16 times, eventually ceasing to exist except as map coordinates. Conditions at Verdun exceeded human endurance. Constant artillery turned the battlefield into a churned sea of mud, corpses, and metal. Shell holes filled with water, gas, and body parts became death traps. Soldiers lived in this landscape for weeks, unable to bury the dead who became part of the terrain. The smell was overwhelming: decomposition, gas, cordite. Men went mad from constant bombardment, developing shell shock in epidemic numbers. Water and food arrived contaminated with corpse-tainted mud. Wounded often couldn't be evacuated, dying where they fell. Both sides developed rotation systems, cycling divisions through the furnace, but units returned to find previous survivors unrecognizable, aged, broken, traumatized. The battle's final phase saw roles reverse as French counteroffensives recaptured lost ground. These attacks, using improved tactics including creeping barrages and specialized assault units, proved equally costly. The recapture of Fort Douaumont cost 100,000 casualties. By December, lines approximated February's positions. The battle achieved nothing except mutual destruction. Falkenhayn was dismissed, his attrition strategy having bled Germany as badly as France. The French army, while victorious, was psychologically shattered. Mass mutinies would follow in 1917. Verdun entered collective memory as war's ultimate horror, where industrial killing reached its apex. The Battle of Passchendaele, 1917. Death in the Mud. The Third Battle of Ypres, commonly known as Passchendaele, after the village that became its objective, fought from July 31st to November 10th, 1917, produced casualties that horrified even World War I veterans. British Empire forces suffered approximately 325,000 casualties, German forces 260,000, for minimal territorial gain. The deepest advance was less than 5 miles. Some attacking units experienced 70 to 90% casualties, with men drowning in mud or disappearing entirely in the liquefied battlefield. Passchendaele became synonymous with military futility, where men died not from enemy action but from the battlefield itself, which rain and bombardment had transformed into an ocean of mud that swallowed armies. Field Marshal Douglas Haig conceived the offensive to break out of the Ypres salient, capture Belgian ports housing German U-boats, and relieve pressure on the French army, still recovering from widespread mutinies. The plan required speed, break through before autumn rains turned Flanders' reclaimed swampland into quagmire. However, preliminary bombardments lasting weeks both eliminated surprise and destroyed drainage systems maintaining the land. When the offensive began on July 31st, the heaviest rain in 30 years began falling. The combination of unprecedented bombardment and torrential rain created conditions unique even by Western Front standards. The battlefield became an apocalyptic landscape that defied description. Shell holes filled with liquid mud, deep enough to drown men, became death traps invisible under surface slime. Wounded who slipped off duckboard tracks disappeared forever. Units advancing through this morass moved at hundreds of yards per hour, exhausted before reaching German lines. Rifles clogged with mud were useless. Men fought with shovels and bare hands. Artillery pieces sank irretrievably. Tanks, supposed breakthrough weapons, bogged down immediately, becoming static targets. The mud made evacuation impossible. Wounded lay for days in shell holes, many drowning as water levels rose. The battle's phases reflected increasing desperation as initial objectives became impossible. The August attacks at Langemarck and Glencorse Wood saw entire battalions disappear in the mud, their fate unknown until bodies emerged years later. The September attacks on Menin Road Ridge briefly succeeded, using new bite-and-hold tactics. Limited advances thoroughly consolidated, but required massive casualties for minimal gain. October's attacks occurred in worsening conditions as autumn rains intensified. Men advanced through mud chest deep, taking hours to cover yards. Some units reported spending more effort pulling men from mud than fighting Germans. The final phase focused on capturing Passchendaele village, which gave the battle its common name. Canadian Corps, brought in as fresh troops, were assigned this objective. Even these elite forces, using innovative tactics and careful preparation, suffered 16,000 casualties, capturing a village that no longer existed except as map coordinates. The village, sitting on slightly higher ground, had become the battle's symbol. Its capture would provide something to show for hundreds of thousands of casualties. When Canadians finally took Passchendaele on November 6, they found only brick dust and corpses. The battle's end brought no victory, only exhaustion. The Ypres salient remained a dangerous bulge in British lines, abandoned months later without fight, when the German spring offensive made it untenable. Passchendaele's only achievement was mutual destruction in conditions that made death preferable to survival. Veterans described experiences beyond civilian comprehension, friends vanishing in mud, wounded begging to be shot rather than left to drown, corpses used as stepping stones. The psychological impact created the war's most bitter veterans, convinced their sacrifice was meaningless. Passchendaele entered language as shorthand for military futility, where generals sacrificed armies for objectives that rain and mud had already made impossible. The Battle of Tumu. 1449. The destruction of Ming China's imperial army. The Battle of Tumu, fought on September 14, resulted in one of the most complete military annihilations in Chinese history, with the Mongol forces destroying virtually the entire Ming imperial army. On the second day alone, September Tumu, the 30,000-strong Mongol army under Esin Khan massacred approximately 500,000 Chinese soldiers, mostly militia, in what may be history's largest single-day slaughter. The battle saw the capture of the Zhengtong Emperor himself and the obliteration of Ming military power, demonstrating how tactical superiority could overcome seemingly impossible numerical odds. The casualty rate approaching 100% for the Chinese forces makes Tumu one of history's most complete military disasters. The campaign began with the young Zhengtong Emperor's decision to personally lead a punitive expedition against Mongol raiders, influenced by his eunuch advisor Wang Zhen, who sought military glory. The emperor mobilized a massive force reported at 500,000 men, though most were hastily conscripted peasant militia with minimal training and equipment. This unwieldy host, accompanied by the imperial court and massive baggage trains, advanced slowly into the steppe, violating basic principles of fighting mobile nomadic enemies. The emperor, only 22 years old, treated the campaign as an imperial procession rather than military operation, fatal misunderstanding of the enemy he faced. Essen Khan, leading approximately 30,000 veteran Mongol cavalry, employed classic steppe tactics perfected over centuries. Rather than directly confronting the massive Chinese army, Mongol forces harassed its flanks, attacked supply lines, and denied access to water sources. The Chinese army, already struggling with logistics in hostile terrain, began disintegrating before the main battle. When the emperor finally ordered retreat, it was too late. The army was demoralized, exhausted, and strung out over miles of steppe. Essen had maneuvered them into a trap at Tumu, where terrain favored cavalry and escape routes were blocked. The first day's fighting saw the complete destruction of the 20,000-strong Chinese cavalry force, eliminated by superior Mongol horsemen in running battles. This removed any Chinese ability to counter Mongol mobility or protect the infantry mass. That night, the Chinese army, deprived of water and demoralized by cavalry losses, began disintegrating. Desertion was impossible. The steppe offered no refuge, and Mongol patrols killed stragglers. The emperor's presence prevented organized withdrawal, as abandoning him was unthinkable, yet protecting him paralyzed military decision-making. The second day witnessed slaughter on an unprecedented scale. At dawn, Mongol horse archers surrounded the Chinese mass and began methodical killing. The Chinese militia, armed primarily with agricultural implements, hastily converted to weapons, had no answer to mounted archers. Attempts to form defensive formations collapsed as officer corps was targeted and eliminated. When Chinese soldiers attempted surrender, throwing down weapons and kneeling in submission, they discovered no quarter would be given. Essen Khan had no means to guard or feed hundreds of thousands of prisoners and ordered complete extermination. The massacre continued throughout September Tumming, with Mongol warriors rotating in fresh horses to maintain the killing pace. Chinese accounts describe arrows falling like rain, corpses piling in mounds, and ground so soaked with blood that horses struggled for footing. Panic-stricken Chinese soldiers trampled each other, attempting escape, adding to casualties. Some units attempted final stands, but surrounded and without water, they were methodically destroyed. By day's end, contemporary accounts state that of 500,000 Chinese soldiers, virtually none survived, one of history's most complete military annihilations. The emperor's capture, rather than death, added humiliation to catastrophe. Taken prisoner, he became a bargaining chip in Mongol negotiations. The destruction of the imperial army left China's northern frontier defenseless, forcing the Ming to negotiate from weakness. Though the emperor was eventually returned and the Ming dynasty survived, Chinese military prestige never recovered. The battle demonstrated that numerical superiority meant nothing against mobile enemies employing superior tactics in favorable terrain. Tumu forced fundamental changes in Chinese military thinking, leading to increased reliance on fortifications, ultimately the improvement and extension of the Great Wall, rather than field armies to face nomadic threats. Conclusion: patterns in annihilation. These 20 battles, spanning over 2 millennia, reveal consistent patterns in military disasters, achieving the highest casualty rates. Several factors repeatedly appear: divided or incompetent command, Arausio, Isandlwana, refusal to acknowledge changing tactical realities, Somme Verdun, ideological fanaticism preventing rational surrender, Berlin Manila, technological or tactical mismatch, Carrhae Rorke's drift, and perhaps most critically, the elimination of retreat options through encirclement, Cannae Kiev, or terrain, Thermopylae Teutoburg forest. The evolution from ancient to modern warfare changed the scale, but not the nature of military annihilation. While ancient battles might destroy tens of thousands in single days through sword and spear, modern industrial warfare achieved similar casualty rates through artillery and starvation over extended periods. The personal nature of ancient combat, stabbing enemies face to face, gave way to impersonal industrial killing, but the result remained the same. Entire military formations ceased to exist, leaving only historical lessons about the fatal consequences of military hubris, tactical inflexibility, and the terrible arithmetic of war when escape becomes impossible. These battles also demonstrate war's impact beyond immediate military casualties. The destruction of armies meant the elimination of entire generations, demographics altered for decades, civilizations ended, Baghdad, empires redirected, Teutoburg forest, and national psyches permanently scarred, Verdun, Passchendaele. The survivors, when any existed, carried physical and psychological wounds that affected families and societies for generations. The battles with the lowest survival rates thus represent not just military disasters, but human catastrophes whose effects rippled through centuries. Understanding these battles requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about human nature and warfare. The same intelligence that creates civilizations can devise methods for their complete destruction. Military excellence can serve genocide as easily as defense. Courage and discipline can lead men to walk knowingly into death rather than shame. Technology amplifies both military capability and capacity for annihilation. Perhaps most disturbingly, these battles show that ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances, can both inflict and endure horrors that peacetime minds cannot comprehend. The study of battles with the lowest survival rates serves as warning and education. They remind us that war, despite rules and conventions attempting to limit its horror, retains the capacity for complete annihilation. They demonstrate that military defeat can mean not just loss but extinction. They show that ideological conviction can override survival instinct, leading entire armies to choose death over dishonor. Most importantly, they prove that the veneer of civilization is thin. Beneath lies the same capacity for total war that destroyed armies at Cannae, Stalingrad, and Tumu. These battles stand as monuments to military catastrophe, reminding future generations that in war's arithmetic, the equation can always equal zero.